Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Schwartz. I am one of the onboarding specialists here at Legal Server, and I'm here to talk to you today about another tool in your Legal Server toolkit called guided navigation. Guided navigation is a way for us to communicate with Legal Server that we want it to do something when certain conditions are met. This is very similar to what Leah was just speaking about when she showed you branch logic using whether or not you like steak, and then if you answer yes, pulling up a question regarding what kind of steak you like or what cut of steak you like. I didn't see New York strip on that list, so I am personally and deeply offended. So guided navigation can go a little bit deeper than branch logic in that branch logic relies on an if and then statement. Do you like steak? If so, if you say yes, we'll pull up this question. But guided navigation can use conditional expressions. Branch logic can't very easily account for or statements like if you like steak or you like fish, or if you like steak but you don't like fish. And that's something that we can account for in guided navigation. Guided navigation also has the additional ability to tell the system to do something aside from pulling up a form that has fields and blocks on it, like setting the values of those fields or generating a document or performing what's called an API call. We're going to take a look at that all today. Guided navigation is also non-linear in that you don't have to follow along with a branch logic statement. You can have answered at some other point in time that you do like steak, and then the system will have that information available to it. It doesn't have to be part of the guided navigation chain like it would in branch logic. So I think a concrete example would help here. And I'm going to pull one, speaking of help, out of what may or may not be my own personal experience. Maybe some of you folks have run into this before as well, where you have a set of messy conditions that you need to account for if you're going to set one of your cases to under a program. So here we have our high empathy law project, and cases that either where either the applicant where this I'm sorry, where the applicant is either a senior citizen or they're a resident of Adams County and under 125% of the federal poverty guidelines. I remember having chart upon chart in my office when I was in practice like this that would tell me how to send a case to a particular program. We're going to build out a guided navigation dialog, which is going to help us pick the program or pick the proper case to send to this help program. So let's take a look at our sandbox here. I'm going to come into our demo site, and I've created a very basic intake here on the sidebar called the guided navigation demo intake. Let's take a look at it. And at this point, you may or may not be familiar with processes in Legal Server and the fact that they are each made up of forms in Legal Server. And we can see that this process has 3 forms in it. The first form here, because we're really using this for demonstration purposes, we're just simulating an intake. We've got a box here for first name and last name. Then we've got county of residence, and we're just going to pick from this list. Here's Adams County, one of the conditions in our hypothetical. Then we've just got a simple Boolean field, yes or no. Yes, the person is a senior citizen, or no, they're not. And then we have a raw initial percentage of poverty field. And this is something that you'll more than likely be calculating on your own intakes if you do ask financial questions through one of the financial information blocks. And so you won't really ever have the raw percentage field, but we can come in here and we can set whatever percentage we want. So very basic first form in this process here. Let's take a look at the rest of the process. And so I'm coming into our little admin button here, and I clicked on edit form, and here I am in that first form. And I'm going to click on the shortcut to get me to the process. Here's our 3 different forms. Let's take a look at the second form first. So the second form, also simple, right? We've got a header element there, and then we have this dialog runner element. We can see that it's a block. The dialog runner is what's going to tell our form to run one of our guided navigation dialogues. We call each guided navigation that we build out a dialog. And when we open this up, we can see that we're going to pick from the dialogues that we've got on the site here, which dialog we want the dialog runner to go to first. And that's going to be something that becomes relevant a little bit later. And we can have a start over button or a skip button if we want here. We've also got stealth mode, which is something that we'll go into when we see the dialog runner in action as well. I'm going to close that up. And let's take a look at the third step in the intake process, the third form here. Very, very basic disposition page, right? Last page of an intake. And our relevant field here is going to be intake program. And I'm showing this to you like a magician that's showing you that there's nothing up my sleeves. If the guided navigation doesn't trigger, if it doesn't run with our conditions, or if something fails, then the intake program is going to default to the general value. Now, we want to create a guided navigation dialog that's going to help us get to help, right? So if we don't do that, or if we change the conditions so that they don't fit under the criteria of our grant here, then that intake program is not going to go to help. It's going to stay on its default value of general. Guided navigation lives under the big admin tab. Let's close some of these tabs here so we don't bounce around too much. It lives under the big admin tab. You can find it on the sidebar or by typing guided navigation. And we're going to hop in here. Let me make my screen a little bit bigger. Okay, and we can see on our guided navigation section front here that we've got interactive dialogues and navigation dialogues. And we're going to talk about the differences between those later. I think once we build one and we do a little bit of testing, I'll be able to better describe what a navigation dialogue is to you. So we've got a couple here. We're going to start a new one. Now, it helps me to think about the guided navigation dialog as the process. And then what lives on that process when the dialog runner runs are the different segments of that process. So let's see, first thing we want to do here is come up with a name for our dialog. Let's call this our April 2021 call, or guided navigation. And you can see here that even though we clicked or even though we were on the interactive tab, we can choose to create a navigation dialog here if we choose to. We're going to leave the interactive dialog. And this dialog is currently made up of no segments. So we want to add a new segment. And this is going to be a very simple dialog. And just to remind you, our goal is going to be to come up with this expression here. We want to create a dialog that's going to look at the information already on the case. And if the person is a senior citizen, which is collected on our first page, then we're going to stick them into the High Empathy Law Project. Or if they're a resident of Adams County and under 125% of the initial federal poverty guidelines percentage, we're going to stick them in the High Empathy Law Project. So let's come up with our segment name here. Let's call this Set My Program so we know exactly what we're doing. As we go through and you think of more and more complex dialogues, naming conventions are going to be very important. We want to know where to find our information. But we're just going to have one segment in this dialog here. Then we've got elements, and those of you who have been on the administrator's end of Legal Server might recognize some of these elements here. I'm going to add the first element, and we'll only really need one. Well, we'll need a couple of elements, actually. Let's be a little bit fancy. So we see headlines here and instructions here, and they function the same way they do on forms and on profiles. Field to capture is going to call up a field and then put it on the page. So for our do you like steak branch logic that we created, do you like steak was the first field, and then the second field was the multi-select regarding what kinds of cuts of steak that you liked. And we can call up certain blocks here on the page to perform the same function. And we can also add a note for the summary, or give the person who's running the dialogue space to add a note in for the summary there. But we also have some actions that this dialog could perform. And when I mentioned before that guided navigation dialogues can tell Legal Server to do something for us beyond branch logic giving us a form to perform actions on, this is what I meant here. So we can set a default value for several of our blocks in Legal Server, or we can tell Legal Server to create a document from one of our document templates, or add in a case note, or perform an API call. And these can each be a full call topic on their own. We're going to focus today on something very simple, which is we're going to tell Legal Server, without further input from us, to set a field's value. So that's the action that we want them to perform. I'd like to draw your attention to when the next radio button here is when segment is shown, or when segment is submitted. So this will become more relevant as you build out longer and longer segments that have multiple elements on them. Maybe one element is going to affect an element that you placed on that form, on that segment previously. Then you'll want to think about when you want the action to be performed. Is there some relevant information that you're changing above on the same segment? If so, you want that action to be performed when the segment is submitted, rather than when the segment is shown. We're going to leave this on when segment is shown because the information that this dialog is running off of was entered on the first page, and we don't really want it to do anything else aside from setting the field's value. And what field's value do we want to set here? We want to set intake programs. So let's go into our search here and call up the intake program field. And then let's pick our help, our high empathy law project. So now we've told Legal Server what to do, and we're going to look at the very first tent pole that we'll talk about today of guided navigation, or at least one of the very biggest tent poles. And that's the ability to create entering logic. So this is what we want Legal Server to do. And we can have that action always performed whenever this segment is called up, whenever the dialog that this segment lives on is called up. Or we can use an expression here. So when I click on expression, we see we've got a space here that pops up on our expression editor. This is what gives it its name. That's going to allow us to put entering logic in to tell Legal Server when it should perform this action. So let's see, the first thing that we wanted to do was we want to set the intake program to help when the applicant is a senior citizen, using our very simple senior citizen Boolean, which is right here. Okay. And when I do that, I've got another expression that pops up here. I've got the conditional that pops up that's asking me when do I want this to, or what condition do I want to set here? So I want when senior citizen equals yes. But I've got some other operators that I can use here if I choose to. You can see there's equal when the senior citizen question is empty. Or meaning that the person who's running the dialogue, who has access to answering the question, didn't enter an answer. Or when the senior citizen Boolean is not empty, which would be the equivalent of making it so that either yes or no, either answer. As long as there's an answer in there, then this entering logic is going to trigger and the action is going to be performed. But we want senior citizen to equal yes here. We're not done though. We need to add in another condition, and that second entering logic condition here is if the person is a senior citizen, or if they're a resident of Adams County and under 125%. So let's add in resident of Adams County first. We're going to come over here to the left, and we're going to, or to the right, camera left, not really camera left. And we're going to add another bit of entering logic for county of residence here. There we go. And when we enter county of residence, so we're dealing with two different types of fields. County of residence is a lookup where senior citizen is a Boolean. It could be yes or it could be no. And so the operator changes contextually to give me some other options here. Not many other options, but several other options here, right? When county of residence is in Adams County, that's the one that we want. But we can also pick when county of residence is not in Adams County, and that'll give us an exclusion. That'll exclude Adams County from triggering this logic. And we've also got our is empty and is not empty. And so we can leave it like that. But what this actually reads, if you look through it, is perform this action, set the intake program to help if the applicant is a senior citizen, yes, and lives in Adams County. And that's not what we want. So we've got to do a little bit more work here. So maybe the add another condition rule here is not what we're looking for. So let's delete that. Rather than adding a rule, let's add a group here. And this starts to look a little bit more like what we want, right? So let's add in county of residence. And the reason it looks a little bit more like what we want is because now we've got a substatement here, right? A statement that we can add another rule to, county of residence in Adams. And the second rule that we're looking for is to set the percentage of poverty, the initial percentage of poverty. And do take note, you have to be mindful of what fields you're using, because if you just type in poverty, there's going to be a couple of them. Make sure you're not picking, for this example, adjusted percentage of poverty instead of initial percentage of poverty. And here's our operator again, which is again contextually different. An initial percentage of poverty is going to give us a number. So we've got some different operators that we can use. And the one that we're looking for is less than or equal to 125. One more thing to do here is to change our condition from an and statement to an or statement. And then this should be what we're looking for. Set my program, right? Okay, we come in here and we want this action to be performed if the applicant is a senior citizen equals yes, or if county of residence is in Adams and initial percentage of poverty is less than or equal to 125%. So we've got our element that we need here. Let's add in, just so we can keep track of it, let's put a headline in there. And we don't need this headline to appear conditionally. Let's say something slightly creepy. Guided navigation is thinking. Okay, so I'm adding another element to this segment here, and I'm going to drag it up. I'm going to drag it up to appear before our conditional statement. This will just give us a better visuals when this is running. Since this is an action that we're asking legal server to perform, it's performing it in the background. We're not going to have another indication that this is going on, which can be a benefit in some circumstances. But here, we want to make sure that, that we've run into the segment that we're looking for. So I added that headline there. And if you notice with the headline element, we can also create entering logic so that that headline will only appear under the conditions that we provide for. We're going to scroll down here. We'll skip over output expressions for now, but we're going to come back to it. Let's take a look at default destination. So this is asking me, what should I do once I've run this dialog? And it's defaulting to go to another segment. But we don't want that to happen. This is our only mission for today. So once this segment is run, we're going to exit the dialog and move on with the rest of our process. I'm going to click on Save Segment here. And I'm going to click on Save Dialog. All right, and here's our dialog on our list of interactive dialogues. Let's come to the home page. And we're going to go into our guided navigation demo intake. Now that we've got our dialog, I'm going to come to small admin edit form, edit the process here to get to our set my program where the dialog runner lives. Now that we've created it, we've got to make sure that our dialog runner is pointing at it. So we're going to point at our April 2021 guided navigation and click on continue. And we should be good to go. Let's see if we can cause the intake program to become the high empathy law project, the HELP project, if we enter senior citizen or a resident of Adams County and under 125% of the initial federal poverty guidelines percentage. Here we go. Let's give our intake a name. County of residence is, well, now we can make a decision, right? Do we want this to be a senior? I would say no. Let's see if we can trigger that second clause. So resident of Adams County and under 125% of poverty. Click on continue here. Okay, this orange bar is what I meant when we were looking at the dialog runner and I said that there was an option to run in stealth mode. We have administrator capabilities to edit guided navigation. So we're going to see this orange bar, but if we click on that stealth mode, then folks who don't have that permission set are not going to see the orange bar on the front end. So another way of making things unobtrusive. And below it, we see our guided navigation is thinking headline. And again, we had that headline appear regardless, it didn't have any entering logic. So regardless of whether or not our conditions have been met, that headline is appearing. But you'll notice there's no indication that legal server is performing that action in the background. Okay, and here's our intake program field. We're no longer in the default of the general program. We fulfill the conditions on that guided navigation dialog, and so legal server performs the action that we were expecting. I won't open this intake. I think we can leave it where it is. Any thoughts or questions before we continue here? Let's hop on back to guided navigation under the large admin tab. Okay, we've got a couple of other interactive dialogues here. Let's take a quick look at our housing questions dialogue. Guided navigation is not limited to just running one dialogue. If you provide it with the path, it's going to follow that path through segments, through different dialogues until it's met the conditions to exit the dialogue. And we set that, that segment on our own when we set the default destination to exit the dialogue. So let's take a look at this housing questions dialogue. We can see that this is one that's built up of a couple of different segments here. We are going to change the hypothetical a little bit. I would like to ask some housing questions if the resident that we're dealing with lives in Alexander County, regardless of what the outcome was for what intake program they're being sent to, regardless of whether or not that triggers. I want to ask the residents of of Alexander County some additional housing questions. And maybe those questions, in this case, they are contained in a different dialogue. They're not the first step of this dialogue. If you take a look up here, the entry point for this dialogue is the intro segment. And if we come over here and we use the preview tool, if we hover over it, we can get a brief view of what's inside that segment. And we could, of course, click on edit, and we can see that it's comprised, just like the preview showed us, of a headline and of some very brief instructions with HTML in there so that we have a link to HUD's website. I'm not going to need that in my dialogue. I just want to ask the housing questions. We've already got financial information. We can see what's in there by, again, hovering over the preview. Housing questions is where I want to get to. So in order to get to housing questions, I need to go back to well, actually, let's take a look at housing questions first. Let's edit this here. And let's just make sure that these are the right questions that we want to ask. So we're calling up a field to capture, which means that this field is going to populate the page. It's not hidden here. It's not, we can set it to be required or read only. And the first question that we're going to ask is about the current living situation. Then we've got another question here about what the housing legal issue is, and that has some conditional entering logic, right? This is only going to pop up if the current living situation is one of these rent selections. And we can have the answer to that entering logic be one of multiple choices. We don't have to create a new entering logic expression for each of those different choices, unless that's helpful in some other regard, if we're going to connect it with a different rule or a different group of rules. And then regardless, always true here of what the answer to the previous questions were, we're going to ask how long you've lived in the current residence. And then another conditional down here, if you answer that your housing legal issue is other, we're going to pop up, this is a text field here. I know you can't see it here, but you can take my word for it. I think I would also like to ask for these housing questions. Another question. I think I would like to ask what the color of your door is for certain certain issues regarding service, right? Checking to see if the process server accurately described the color of your door. Another tent pole in guided navigation that it's important to point out, I think, is the ease at which you can create fields and lookups from within the expression editor here. If we come up to create a field, if you've created other lookups and fields in Legal Server, you know that you have to go into the Big Admin tab and create your lookup, and then you have to go in and create a field, and you have to tell the system if you want it to be a multi-select field or a single select field. You're able to do that from within the expressions editor here, so that when you are building out complex guided navigation dialogues, you don't have to exit your guided navigation expression editor to do so. And I think it's really helpful in my opinion here. So we are going to create, and you can see that we can point to a system lookup or an existing custom lookup here. And we've got our Boolean fields and our number fields and our text fields here. We're going to create a new custom lookup. And we're just going to put in door color. And we're going to add our values. Let's see, there's white and brown and black and green and red. Those are my values, and it is that easy to create a new field within the expressions editor of guided navigation. So now we've got to add that field that we've just created to our form here. So we're going to add in another field to capture. I think we want this one to always be true. We're not going to create any new entering logic. And we called it door color. And if that's not descriptive enough, then we can, of course, give it a label. And let's set that as a drop-down menu. I'm not going to make it required or anything like that. And I'm going to save that segment. So we've made some changes to the housing question segment, the housing question segment on the housing questions dialog here. Let's hop back now to our April 2021 guided navigation. And we'll come back into set my program, our one lonely segment on this dialog. Now, I had said that when the applicant lives in Alexander County, I don't want them to exit this dialog. I want them to go on to that portion of the housing questions dialog that contains the housing questions. And for that, I'm going to use an output expression. So here I'm going to add this expression. And you can see that I don't have to add any elements because this is just really directing traffic now. I'm saying rather than exiting this dialog, I want a condition to be true. And if that condition is true, I want to shunt you to a different place. So I'm going to choose not this dialog, but I'm going to choose our housing questions dialog. And I don't have to start at the intro segment. I can pick anywhere I want to on that dialog to begin. I'm going to pick housing questions here. And now let me set my condition. So it's going to be county of residence again. And this time it's going to be Alexander County. And before I click on save here, I just want to note that there is a condition where there is a set of conditions where both of these items are going to trigger, right? So obviously, county of residence, if it's in Adams, then our output expression isn't going to trigger. But if we're talking to a senior citizen, then we are going to set the intake program field to help. But we're also, if they live in Alexander County, going to take them over to our housing questions dialog and our housing questions segment there. I'm going to click on save segment and save dialog. Let's come back and let's see if we can trigger that happening, both the housing questions dialog and the set my program dialog, the two conditions there. Let's see if we could trigger that. I'm very creative with names. Let's pick Alexander County. Actually, let's make this a senior citizen, right? Because they don't live in Adams County, so their percentage of poverty doesn't actually matter. This is a well-to-do person, probably in our society, that lives in Alexander County and is a senior citizen. We'll click continue here. So here our dialog runner is doing its thing. Guided navigation is thinking is the first segment that it should run to. And if we click on next here, here come our housing questions because we triggered the output expression conditional. And if we pick here one of the rent conditions, then housing legal issue is going to pop up. And if we pick other, then we're going to get our housing legal other. We didn't pay much attention to what order we were putting this in. We should do that if we're trying to create a logical flow for our questions. Housing legal issue other should be moved up onto under housing legal issue. And then how long have you lived in your current residence, and what color is your door? Those are going to pop up regardless of, because they don't have any entering logic on them. They're always being shown if we're on this segment. And when I click continue here, in addition to those housing questions, we can see that our intake program once again has been set to help. So both of those segments on both of those different dialogues triggered. And you can really build out some elaborate pathing in Legal Server by using guided navigation. Guided navigation can be used to replicate an entire intake process. You can build out an intake process using guided navigation. And as you can imagine, where we have a certain flow now of how our intake works. We go from form to form to form on a process. Using guided navigation, we can pick and choose what we want to populate based on those conditionals. So very powerful on the process end. And in addition to intake forms, we can use them, and we're increasingly use them to build out our online intake if that's something that your program is interested in building. Any thoughts or questions on guided navigation on any of the things that we talked about today? I've got a few other things to point out, but please feel free to unmute yourself or put some questions in the chat. Or as I mentioned, I'll stop recording at some point in the next couple of minutes, and you can ask your questions after recording has ended if you'd like them not to be preserved for all time and space. So let's come back to guided navigation one more time. Let's go into the housing questions dialog. I wanted to point out two visualization tools that are useful. Oh, we've got a question here. Can you create a conditional expression on income type? I'm trying to do this and it's not working for me. So that raises a good point in guided navigation. The way that guided navigation works currently, blocks have to be added to a certain part of the code to make all of their functionality work within guided navigation. I don't have a current list of all the blocks that work and don't work and which are bugged and which aren't working properly in guided navigation. But If you run into an expression that seems like it was written correctly but isn't doing what you expect it to do, whether it's income type or funding code or some of the financial blocks, let us know. Send us an email. We'll check to see if it's on the guided navigation developers development chart if we know about it, and if we don't, then we'll spin up a new ticket. The expectation is that most, if not all, blocks are going to function with guided navigation, but they might not currently. So there are some tools to help you build out guided navigation as you're building things out and they're getting bigger and bigger. Two visualization tools here. One is kind of similar to that preview that helps you look within a segment. And if we click on view as questionnaire here, we're going to get what kind of looks like a questionnaire, right? It looks like a listing of all the questions that we ask and what the different options are in our fields and where, more importantly, each of those segments are going to end up by default or conditionally if we add in some conditions as an output expression. That is the first way to visualize things. And then the second visualizer here will put our interview into a node format, right? So each bubble here is a different segment. And if we hover over it, perhaps you can see in the lower left-hand corner the name of the different segment that I'm pointing at. I put on that lonely segment in the housing questions dialog because I wanted to illustrate that this visualizer gives you a really good way to find out if the segment that you're working on isn't connected with anything else. Very, very useful. And we're looking at some very basic dialogues here. But when you build out something more elaborate, that tool can be very, very powerful. Here we're looking at a dialogue that was meant for an expungement interview. And you can see that you start out here on the green bubble and you've basically got 3 or 4 different options as to where you can go. And depending on how you answer each of those questions, you might even end up back at the start here. So this can give you kind of an overview of what you're doing here and help you issue spot. Is this segment here, if you hover over it, this is just a JPEG that we're looking at here, but if we were looking at it in the expression editor, we would know what segment this is, and we would be able to ask ourselves if the dialog is supposed to exit here or dead end here. Let's see, any tips on troubleshooting when output expressions are not redirecting to a different segment? I have one set moved from one segment to another within the same dialog, but it's not working. I have some general troubleshooting tips that I can add in addition to what we've already gone over in terms of naming conventions, which we can kind of see built out a little bit here, right? We've got a numbering convention here. This is maybe we can think of when we're outlining it as the first set of questions that we want to ask before moving on to the second set. And then just coming up with pretty descriptive names so that you know if you've got something that you need to amend, where you're putting, where you might find that question or that element. When it comes to troubleshooting output expressions, what I might recommend doing is building a more bare segment and seeing if the element, just the element that I want to trigger that output expression is working properly, and then building up that segment from there. What you really want to do when you're building guided navigation is be able to break things out into smaller quantities. So if you run into a problem with an element somewhere in the middle of your form, you can isolate that element and either remove it or find out why it's not working. If some of you have troubleshooted with us before over support emails regarding branch logic, you might have heard us say that we can, go down to 1 or 2 layers of branch logic, as Leah was talking about before. But once we start getting to the 3rd layer, it becomes almost impossible for us to see the path that you're trying to follow. The same is true in guided navigation, perhaps even more so since it could be more elaborate. But just as a general prospect, if you run into a problem with guided guided navigation, make a bare segment and see if you can make that segment move in the way that you want to. If you can't, and you can't figure out why that is, it'll be much easier for us to troubleshoot something that doesn't have a ton of elements on it than it will be for us to isolate what might be going wrong with one of your earlier elements. You're welcome. Okay, and just as a general prospect, also as you're building things out, test regularly. If you're building a full intake, it might seem tedious for you to have to start at the beginning of your guided navigation and follow it through so that you're on step 5 or 15 or 20. But if you don't do that and something goes wrong somewhere in the middle, you're going to be recreating a lot of your work and retracing a lot of your steps to figure out where things have went wrong. You can mitigate that by using naming conventions and being elaborative when you're describing what is in the segment, what's supposed to be in the segment. And you can also mitigate a lot of that by outlining what you want your guided navigation to do rather than just kind of hopping in and following along with whatever you think the next question should be. But test regularly, even if it does get tedious. Go from the beginning to the end and see if the different exit points that you've created are going where they're supposed to go. I did not explain the difference between interactive and navigation dialog, but now that we know what our output expressions are, I think I'm more equipped to do that by way of illustration here. So let's come back into guided navigation. We know what our interactive dialogues are. They're collections of segments, which include elements and output expressions. And if we hop over to navigation dialogues, we've got an example in here already, and we open that up. What we see here in output our navigation dialog is only the output expression. So this is a segment that is going to perform as a path or a traffic cop. It's not going to have any elements on it. It's just going to be about directing someone from using a dialogue runner from one thing to the next, from one dialogue, one segment on the dialogue to the next, without going through any elements, whether they're conditional or not. And as I mentioned earlier, not every block is available in guided navigation. Um, but they're added as we prioritize things internally. So please do let us know if there's something in guided or not in guided navigation, or if you find something that's not working properly. Very important for us to get eyes on any sort of issues that we could troubleshoot. And again, just keep in mind that troubleshooting a very complex dialogue, the folks who are best equipped to troubleshoot complex dialogues are going to be the ones who created them. So try to break down things into digestible chunks when something's going wrong and see if you can troubleshoot that way, but always feel free to, hit us up if you can't figure it out. One other pro tip that I'll give you is what I found with guided navigation, the way that things work right now, is that you don't want to common technique in legal server is when you're working on a form and a process and maybe another form and another process to open things up in different tabs at the same time. Not a super great idea. With guided navigation, the way that the segments save and the dialogue save can are in order of the most recent save. So if you've built out something very elaborate and you have that same and you save the segment and you save the dialogue, but you have the same segment open in a different window, what appears to be happening with that segment that has older information in it because you haven't reloaded, when you click on save, it's overwriting some of the work that you've done. So that can lead you to very maddening and frustrating situations that I'd rather you avoid by working in just one window when you're working on guided navigation. Any other thoughts or concerns before we wrap up for today? I see that Ron has put the help page for guided navigation in the chat. Thank you, Ron. If you have any other questions that you can't find the answers to on our help page, please feel free to send us an email at support. We look forward to you experimenting and seeing how you can use guided navigation. And I know it's kind of a lot to absorb when you're just being introduced to a concept. Some of you are already using it in the field. You'll know when you've got a condition that you want legal server to work a little bit harder on for you, and when you might want to experiment with guided navigation. But you don't have to wait until then. You can create a very simple dialog like we did today and just run it through its paces and see if you can identify the different things we did and get it to do what you want it to do. Okay, I'm going to stop recording in case people would like to ask questions off the, let's see here.